Hi everybody, welcome back to Post-it. This is our 5th section of Post-it. So when we left off last time, we were trying to figure out how this whole thing got started. We know the phones have been banned from the school thanks to Ruby Sandals' text message. We also learned about how Eric, now we call him Frost, how he ended up being friends with Bench and Dee Dee and oh my goodness, what is it? Wolf. Sorry. And we learned how they met, how he met Bench on the bus, how he met Dee Dee and Wolf inside the woods, and how they all started hanging out with each other for 2 years. They've been a close pack. So that's where we left off. So now Posted. That first Monday after the cell phone crackdown, I went to my locker before 7th period to grab my Spanish notebook. Attached to the metal door above the combination was a sticky note, standard yellow, from one of the packs that every student was required to buy at the start of the year for no real reason whatsoever. It was from Dee Dee. It said, "Welcome to the Dark Ages." He didn't sign it, but I knew it was from him. Nobody else would be so melodramatic. That was the first one, the one that started it all, I guess. I folded it in half, dropped it in the bottom of my locker, and didn't give it a second thought. The next chapter, the variable. So, Frost. Dee Dee, Bench, Wolf, tribal names, all names we gave to each other, all except Frost. I was Frost before I even met them. Word of advice, if you ever get the chance to win your 5th grade district-wide poetry competition, don't do it. Or if you do it, keep it to yourself, because sometimes things stick. They attach themselves like burrs on your socks and they follow you. Like that story your parents always tell your friends' parents at dinner about how you got into the pantry when you were 4 and you ate a whole box of lemon jello. The powder, not the real stuff, straight out of the package, and turned your tongue bright orange and forced them to call poison control. From that moment on, those people will never eat that stuff again without laughing, and you will forever be Jello Boy, in addition to all the other things that you've become. More often, in school at least, it's a label, thrown out on a whim, maybe by some kid trying to get a giggle from the kid next to him. But then it's picked up again and passed around until it becomes a part of you. The kid who never brushes her hair. The kid whose crack is always showing. The kid with the giant schnoz. The kid who always gets picked last. The kid who blew chunks on stage. These are all real people, except I can't tell you most of their names. Even I don't know them, only by what's stuck, except for the kid who always gets picked last. That was Dee Dee. If you're lucky, or at least not terribly unlucky, the thing that sticks to you will just be a nickname and it won't be a pathetic one, like Frost. Ask most 12-year-old kids to name a poet. They will probably tell you that Shakespeare or Shel Silverstein or Kendrick Lamar. Some of them might say Dr. Seuss, although like my dad says, just because you rhyme stuff, it doesn't necessarily make you a poet. I don't imagine a whole lot of kids would tell you their favorite poet is Robert Frost. I'm probably the only one. I blame my father, in fact. He's the one who introduced us, me and Frost. On a tedious summer Sunday, a glass of wine in his hand, sitting across from me on the porch, he handed me a copy of Frost's selected poems. This is before the Sarasota Shuffle, the big split, back when my parents tried to just ignore each other as much as possible, and I tried to ignore their ignoring. When the house would speak to us in creaks that we would hear because nobody else dared to speak because they were afraid of what might be said. We sat on the porch in the backyard by my mother's bright fuchsia azaleas, just the two of us, sunbaking in the grass. "I think you're old enough," he said to me with a nod, and for a moment I thought he was going to hand me the glass for a sip, but instead he gave me the book. Some dads take their kids fishing or play catch. My dad wrote for a living, just my luck. "I don't like poetry," I said, which wasn't entirely true then and certainly isn't true now. When we did the 50-book challenge in the 4th grade, I was the only one who had a volume of poetry on my list, Jack Prelutsky. But the book my dad handed me wasn't anything like Jack Prelutsky. For starters, there was no illustrations. Plus, the cover looked kind of prissy. It was all white and blue flowers. I tried to hand it back, but my father reached over and flipped to a flap-cornered page. "Start with this one," he said. "It's the most famous." The poem was called The Road Not Taken. Dad told me to read it out loud. He was not the kind of father you said no to. Not unless you wanted an hour-long lecture on the topic of things that are just good for you. "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood," I began, and I read it all, careful not to sound too bored, so as not to offend my father, or too interested, so as not to encourage him either. When I was finished, he asked me what I thought about it. I shrugged. Pretty good, I guess, which is actually what I thought. I'd had to read worse stuff in school. I figured that was the end of it. It hadn't dawned on me that my dad might actually be interested in my opinion, but he told me to read it again, quietly, to myself. So I did. with him sitting across from me looking over the porch at the heavy clouds and grimacing at the birds sitting in the maples. I read it again and again, and when I looked back up after the third reading, he asked, "How does it make you feel?" I could feel his cloud-gray eyes on me. He wanted a real answer. He seemed to be holding his breath. "Guilty," I said at last, although I wasn't sure why. That was just the first word that came to mind. My dad reached over and scruffed my hair. "It's not guilt," he said. "It's regret. They aren't quite the same thing." He took another sip of wine and went back into the house, leaving me and Robert Frost on the porch. He moved out 3 months later. I read all 114 poems in the book that summer. More than once, and the next winter, with my mother and father still haggling on the phone about what to do with the house that he didn't live in anymore, I came home with an assignment to write something for the 13th Annual Bratton School District Young Authors Competition. It could be a poem or a short story. You could illustrate if you want to. The winner would receive a medal and a $50 gift card to Barnes & Noble. I wrote a poem inspired by Frost's Mending Wall, my personal favorite of all the 114. Frost's poem was about these two guys who meet in the middle of a field to repair this broken old stone wall that separates their properties. And it has this line, "Good fences make good neighbors," which the speaker of the poem thinks is total crap, and yet he goes on to keep building the fence anyway. And you kind of wonder why. What would happen if they left the wall broken or tore it down completely? Would they still be good neighbors? Would they maybe be better neighbors? Would they maybe be something more like friends? The poem was called Elf's Mischief, and it began, "I am the thing that does not love a wall." It was about all those questions about broken walls and whether good fences made for good families, too. Maybe it was because it wasn't another haiku lazily written on the back of the bus on the way to school. Maybe the teachers who were acting as judges had fence issues of their own, or divorced parents, or both. Because I won. Pretty much the only time in my life I've ever won anything. The day after the award ceremony, my name was called over the morning announcements at school. The teacher made me show everyone the medal and then asked me to stand in front of the class and read the poem out loud. The other kids asked if they could have a gift card, if they could have my gift card. And without even thinking, Mrs. Beck said, "Oh, we have now our very own Robert Frost." Boom. That was it. One comment from my 5th grade teacher and I became someone else, the junior poet laureate of Felsen County. That same night that I earned my new nickname, Frost, my mother drove me to Barnes & Noble in Portage, about an hour away, to spend my reward. I bought her a Frappuccino, and I spent the rest of my money on comic books. And as we passed the sign welcoming us back to Bratton, sitting right in the middle of an empty field, I thought about my father and Sarasota and Frost, and how there are actually a whole buttload of fences out in the world, but most of them were invisible. Deep thoughts for an 11-year-old, I guess. But reading Robert Frost all summer, after your parents split, will do that to you. When I got home, I called my father to let him know about my victory and what the kids were calling me at school, but he wasn't there, and I didn't even bother to leave a message. I told you the whole thing started with Ruby Sandals, and in a way it did, but it was another girl who got the most attention. Her name, her actual name, was Rose, like the delicate flower, though delicate is not the first word I would use to describe her. I know most of it, the war, the notes, the thing about Wolf, probably would have happened regardless, but without her, it would have gone so much differently. She came the same week that the school's ban on cell phones took effect, the same week that Ruby was allowed to return to school after her suspension, the same week that my father wrote me an email telling me about the trip we were going to take next summer to Cape Canaveral. At least it wasn't to Miami for a baseball game. Space shuttles and giant rockets were more up my alley anyway. Rose Holland came that week, and everything changed. There's a famous Alfred Hitchcock movie called The Birds. It sounds like a documentary, but trust me, it's not. In the movie, all the birds in the small California town go all avian apocalypse and start attacking people. You know, like plucking eyes, blowing up gas stations, pecking everyone. It's just about the same time that this one woman shows up, and whether or not she's the reason the birds attack is never clear. It could just be a fluke, or maybe there's something about this lady that makes the birds batty. I watched the movie with Benj, who conked out about halfway through after muttering for an hour straight that any movie without at least one CGI character was bound to be boring. But I watched to the end. I wanted to see if the woman was going to make it out of the town alive or if the birds would get her. I won't spoil it for you just in case, but I will say that sometimes somebody shows up in your life and throws everything out of whack, or just happens to show up at the moment that the out of whackness starts. I wasn't thinking about the birds when Rose Holland appeared at school the day after the Great Confiscation. At the time, I was thinking about algebra. I had a quiz in second period, the dreaded Miss Shears, and had barely bothered to study. And then here comes the new girl, 6 weeks into the semester. In 2+ years, I'd finally gotten comfortable with my surroundings. I knew who I could copy off of and who to avoid in the hall. I had the people I high-fived and the people I nodded to and the people I slunk by, which was most of them. And then here comes this unknown. That's when I saw that I looked at her. This girl from the movie. Not from the movie Bird, but a variable. Person X. Capital X, because if there's one thing you notice about Rose Holland, it's that she was an uppercase. Not big around like Mr. Jackson or Sean Forsett, who looked kind of like a beach ball with limbs glued to his sides. Not even overweight, just big, more squared than rounded. Like she had been constructed of cinder blocks. And of course, this was middle school. I was used to taller girls, but most of the girls at Branton who were tall were also skinny, like stretched out taffy. Rose Holland, she was tall and wide, muscular like Bench. I figured she was an athlete, volleyball maybe, or soccer. She'd make an excellent goalie, practically impenetrable. Yet she walked through the halls the same way all of us did on our first days, with her eyes on the tiles below her feet, her frizzled brown hair lighter than mine hanging over her face like a veil, dark jeans, black sweater that could probably fit 2 of Dee Dee. You could hear the sound of her boots a mile away. "Who is she?" Bench said, standing beside me. "Who knows?" I replied. "She looks like she can hit, like linebacker material." "Be careful," I told her. "She might replace you." Bench didn't have an answer for that. I glanced at the new girl again, noticing everybody step out of her way just to give her a second look when her back was to them. You'd be tempted to tell them, take a picture, it would last longer. Except for nobody had their phone on them anyway. Already there were whispers trailing about her, and you could tell just from that brief walk down the hall that she was going to have a tough first day. And we're going to stop there. See you next time.